in the chat that aren't aware, and Tim can correct me if he disagrees. My view is that when we think of revolutionary nationalism, this comes out of the French Revolution, and so this is not necessarily, in my view, equated with the theology that we read about in the Bible of ethnos, or kind of an indigenous native group of people. The Bible talks about that. Jesus says, go out and convert the ethnoi, right? So this is a Greek term that just means people groups. There are ancient and old nations, right? If we think about, Armenia being one of the earliest to convert, that's an ancient Christian nation. I mean, obviously now we would say they're, non-Chalcedonians or whatever. But the point being is that in my view, the ancient canons of the councils recognize the legitimacy of Christian nations. But this is not the same thing when we get to the post-Enlightenment period and the post-French Revolutionary period, because now we get a new idea of what a nation is. A nation now becomes equated with the sort of merchant class and Freemasonic approach to nationalism. And that's very prominent, very easy to see in the French Revolution, which I know that pretty well and pretty in depth. But so when Tim's talking about nationalism as a kind of a prison or something that's problematic to the vantage point of the Vatican and people like Pius IX that would be in prison in the Vatican, I would agree with that. I mean, I think that's the point here, is that a lot of people, they confuse nationalism post-French Revolution with the notion of ancient nation states going back to, the ancient world even. But that's just to clear up for anybody in the audience that might be, I thought you liked, Christian states. Why you sound like you're anti-nationalist? I'm anti-French Revolution Enlightenment nationalism.
Agreed. I couldn't agree more. I mean, I have to deal with the same thing with tradcasts that are like, oh, what's your anti-nationalism? It's like, well, no, I am a Montesquieuan on the matter, where Montesquieu believed there are three big cardinal rules for what constituted a res publica. And Aristotle says there are three good regimes. I'll go back a little further. Aristotle says there are three good regimes. I'm always with Aristotle. The best is a monarchy. It has a degraded form, which is not a common good subverting form. And that's a tyranny. The second, and that's basically rule by the few or tyranny. Rule by the one or tyranny by the one. My thoughts are scattered tonight. The second good acceptable regime for Aristotle and the Aristotelians, including Thomas, is an aristocracy, which is a rule for the common good by the few, a rule by the few for the common good. And that has a degraded form called an oligarchy, which is a rule not for the common good by the few. And then the third acceptable or good regime is a polity or a republic, a res publica. That is a rule by the many for the good. And it has a degraded form, which Aristotle calls democracy, which is a rule by the many that has been perverted. So there's a couplet in each of these three regimes, and there's a good form. And Aristotle, Thomas, everyone in between, that I study, Catholic political intellectual tradition, says basically the mark for whether or not it's the good form on the left column in each couplet, a monarchy or an aristocracy or a polity, is whether or not there will be in place one, few, or many as rulers, what came to be called subsidiarity by Pius XI. And subsidiarity means basically that in the valences of governing spheres of power, there's inner valences that are closer and more local, and there are outward valences of power. So we go from Jefferson said, I prefer the city to the county to the state to the Fed, right? That is subsidiarity. That the right of first refusal to, I'll use 14th Amendment jurisprudence now, occupy a legislative field, the right to legislate a certain kind of morality, starts local first, and as Pius the 11th will say, only moves to the next outer valence shell if it is not within the generic legislative competency of that inner shell. In other words, most stuff should be legislated by the father of the household. That is a sovereign governing sphere in and of itself. And that's really where most governance should come from. It only gets kicked to municipal government or county government, state government, Fed government, with fewer and fewer legislative fields to be occupied as you move outward. By the time you get to the end, there's almost nothing for the Fed, if it's not in the generic competency of that like orb of power or whatever. So it's very important that when we talk about these, I guess, four popes, Pius IX, Leo XIII, Pius X, and Pius XI, I have something special to say about each of them. They are the four generations of popes, four pontificates that categorically refused to deal with Garibaldi's emplaced government, Italian unification. And that I would imagine, I haven't looked enough into it, but I would imagine all of them, not just Pius IX, shared a kind of commissary with Jefferson Davis. But as a matter of fact, Pius IX sent him a very loving consolation letter, a crown of thorns he allegedly wove for him. You can go see that in New Orleans. And they became great friends. And the Confederacy in the American South, where both you and I are at, Jay, I'm an adoptive Southerner because I love it so much. The center was New Orleans. And of course, I go to the TLM in New Orleans. And the Bishop Lynch, it's a storied history there. The Confederacy was very Catholic friendly because it was borrowing from this idea out of the Catholic intellectual tradition of subsidiarity.
Yeah, I have heard a little bit about this. I would contribute more so in terms of my knowledge when it comes to the issue of Garibaldi, because he was a follower of Giuseppe Mazzini, and of course Giuseppe Mazzini was probably the equivalent to Albert Pike in Europe. I mean, the Albert Pike, being the Confederate Freemasonic philosopher, writing Morals and Dogma, the Bible of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, and Mazzini kind of functions in this way for Europe. And there's a lot of famous letters between Mazzini and people, and Mazzini seems to be also in some degree a successor to the ideals of the French Revolution's Jacobins and true Illuminism. So when we're talking about the actual Illuminati, there's a great book by my publisher that's a really scholarly treatise called Perfectibilists. It's the history of the Bavarian Illuminati, and you can kind of trace the ideological lineage, at least, perhaps even Masonic Lodge lineage, to from the time of the French Revolutionaries, the Jacobins, up through to Mazzini. And so you had these movements in Italy, like Young Italy, and they were really pushing for what at that time was like a radical leftism, which a lot of people don't know that it was nationalist. And so Garibaldi, not only was he famous because he was working towards this notion of Italian unification and kind of a revolutionary nationalism, he was also in many ways kind of one of the fathers of the modern mafia. So the Sicilian mafia actually comes out of a lot of the people that were recruited and fought with Garibaldi. I'm not saying that everybody in the mafia is a Freemason or revolutionary per se, but there was an overlap because a lot of the mafiosi were they were kind of like libertarian militia freedom fighters to a degree before they turned into kind of being kind of a protection racket, organized crime thing. So it's a really fascinating history. The Selwyn Robb book on this is really good for those that are wondering where I'm getting this. But he has his whole first chapter is about this. He doesn't go into Garibaldi, but this also is why there's a connection between there's a ambiguous relationship between organized crime and the papacy as well. So you kind of get at times alliances, at times kind of a falling out, depending, I guess, upon which pope it is and what his policies are in terms of the mafia. But it's also interesting that Garibaldi was part of one of these, I guess I'd say quasi-revolutionary, well, not quasi-illuminist groups called the Carbonari, and they were an occult revolutionary secret society that was also pushing a lot of this revolutionary Masonic stuff. Actually,
I didn't know Garibaldi was Carbonari. Is that
he
really?
Yeah, He was inducted at one point. I think that's right. Yeah, he joined them. There's a great article I'll send you, just written by some like normie historian dude, but he wrote a thing on the history of Italian unification and Garibaldi and Masonry. But yeah, anyway, I won't keep going on that all day, but yeah. So
this is the Carbonari actually, just yes or no. You don't want to stay here. The Carbonari actually high-ranking Masons, or are they fully separate? You hear both stories. I hear both stories.
I'm not sure, because it's like you know, and a lot of these kind of split off in more obscure groups. Like what does it exactly mean to be like regularized? You know what I mean? Like, yeah. For example, you know, Crowley's Masonry, they'll call it Black Masonry and Black Lodges because supposedly they're not officially recognized, but then people will go from, you know, high level Masonry and then go and study the Crowley stuff. So I don't really know exactly what that even means, but I don't know. Good question. I did read a long time ago where I got into this first was there's a Catholic guy, I'm pretty sure he's Catholic. His name's Charles Heckathorn. He has a 2-volume thing on the history of secret societies, and it's a really good book. And I think he covers the Carbonari pretty well in there. But anyway, I'll pass it over to you because, you know, this is the setting, right? This is the background of what's going on in the life of Pius IX, correct?